All right, don't stop me if you've heard this one before. In the beginning, there was the One. But the beginning of his creation wasn't heaven and earth. It was rather the offspring of his thought, primordial powers with thoughts and devices of their own. And while these powers delighted in communion with the One, their knowledge was necessarily imperfect. Through some mixture of ignorance and pride, one of these noble powers fell from its blessed state. Creation itself, our natural world, was implicated in that fall, and nature's basic workings were consequently marred. Down through the ages, the powers that remained in communion with the One struggle against the power that fell away. For this audience, surely that sounds like a relatively colorless summary of the Ainulindale. And it is. To other ears, however, this is the Christian story of creation. It is not, mind you, the creation story as found in Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1. Indeed, none of the Jewish or Christian scriptures tell this story. This account is found rather in the Apocryphon of John, the Tripart Tractate, the Reality of the Rulers, Hypostasis of the Archons is what that text is called. These texts are among those usually labeled Gnostic. Gnosticism was an early Christian heresy, or more accurately, Gnosticism is a category invented by its critics to group together several related but heterogeneous heresies, or Christian groups. As just mentioned, were entirely lost until the discovery of a small library at Nag Hammadi. Let's see if my slides actually shift. Oh, there they are. I'm a slide behind. To the discovery of a small library at Nag Hammadi in 1945. But the doctrines of the Gnostics were nevertheless well known to Christians from antiquity, through the Middle Ages and throughout Tolkien's own 20th century, thanks to their frequent denunciations in theologically orthodox sources. Austin Farrer, for instance, a theologian at Oxford and a close friend of the Tolkiens, took a professional and sometimes sympathetic interest in Gnosticism. Although the term Gnostic and its derivatives never appear in Tolkien's published letters, Tolkien would have certainly been familiar with it as one of Christianity's famous heresies. And actually, there's a really interesting connection between Austin Farrer. Austin Farrer's wife is Catherine Farrer, who is one of the only people who read versions of the Silmarillion and discussed it with Tolkien during Tolkien's lifetime. Austin was originally sympathetic to this and then goes on to sort of publish this great little essay where he compares it to theosophy and things like that, sort of pulled back. But one could do the same thing with C.S. Lewis. Lewis also had some early sympathies and interest with Gnosticism and then adopts a more orthodox position. So, connection, plausible, it's there. Tolkien described Lord of the Rings as a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, and occasionally addressed theological objections to his mythology. He insisted that his stories did not describe the world as it was, but rather as it might have been, with the character of God and human nature left unchanged. Certainly Tolkien believed in his own orthodoxy, but everyone does. Did Tolkien succeed in preserving, except for Aleister Crowley, but did Tolkien succeed in preserving his own fundamental orthodoxy? Or did he unwittingly reproduce an ancient heresy? That's our question. Is Tolkien an unintentional heretic, insofar as he was a sub-creator? Gnosticism cannot be understood without Plato. The varied and heterogeneous movements that constitute Gnosticism are only describable as a single phenomenon because of the intellectual debt they all owe to contemporary Platonism. Socrates' most famous student had tried to answer his teacher's unresolved questions about the nature of truth and justice by interrogating more basic ideas: shapes, numbers, harmonics. What is a circle? Plato asked. No matter how carefully you draw, a circle is something that cannot exist in the physical world. No matter how carefully you draw, there will always be imperfections. And yet the perfect circle is something we can learn about, right? It's something that seems to exist independent of our imaginations, to be out there. Uh, According to Plato, then, the circle must exist on some other immaterial plane of being. It must exist apart from this world as the idea of a perfect circle. But how would we ever come to know anything about these ideas that exist beyond our world? Plato argued that we have access to the ideas because we are not ourselves merely physical beings. We are immaterial minds in material bodies. The good life, according to Plato, is spent getting in touch with these ideas themselves, and consequently distancing oneself from the material realm of imperfections, including, especially, the body. In later articulations, the Platonists maintained that through the contemplation of these perfect ideas, humanity can think the very thoughts of God. These were popular ideas in the 1st and 2nd centuries. It was a theory of knowledge, an account of the human condition, and a vision for the good life. All forms of Christianity were to some extent influenced by Platonism. We're coming back to that at the end. But those Christian movements which contemporaries labeled Gnostic were influenced by Platonic thinking in ways that denied other convictions about God, humanity, and salvation. You are a prince, and you are sent on a mission by your royal parents to the far-off land of Egypt. While there, you start wearing Egyptian clothing, participating in Egyptian customs, eating Egyptian food, and you forget that you're a prince. You go native, as they say. But your parents do not let you go. They instead send you a letter. And that letter reminds you of your royal identity. It reminds you of who and what you really are. And so you begin to take off your Egyptian clothes. You throw away your Egyptian food. You stop speaking the Egyptian language. And weird turn in the story that I'm not making up, the letter turns into a person and begins to walk ahead of you, showing you the way back home. And you follow in its path. This is the hymn of the pearl. It is contained in what's called the Acts of Thomas, and it is, to my mind, the clearest articulation, because it's a story, of what Gnostic theology is all about. Gnostic theology is that we, humanity, has forgotten what it really is, that we are immaterial minds trapped in the foreign land of Egypt, trapped in material reality. In Gnostic texts like the Gospel of Thomas, Mary, and Judas, Jesus teaches his followers to recognize themselves as something transcendent and to separate themselves from concerns of this world and the body. Salvation comes through knowledge of your true self and the illusory world around you. It is this understanding of the human condition, inherited from Platonism, that unites the otherwise disparate threads of Gnostic thought. Stories of primordial powers ruling over creation, like we began with, falling through pride and resisting that fall, are merely attempts to explain how humanity ended up in its ignorant and embodied situation. We will return to these quasi-pantheons and their Tolkienian analogues later. Does Tolkien share the Gnostic understanding of the human plight and its solution? What are humans in the Legendarium? The Silmarillion describes the race of men as children of Iluvatar. Christian sources, both Orthodox and Gnostic, would agree. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, but you will understand that you are children of the living Father. But if you do not know yourselves, you live in poverty, and you are that poverty. The Atani are, according to the Quenta Silmarillion, created by Eru as embodied creatures. This would be unusual in Gnostic mythologies, which usually describe human embodiment as a cosmic accident or a compromise. But it is not unparalleled. In fact, one of the most popular and important Gnostic texts, the Gospel of Thomas, describes God as the creator of the human body. Why do you wash the outside of the cup? Don't you understand that the one who made the inside is also the one who made the outside? What is more or less true for all Gnostic sources, however, is the desire to discard that body. Jesus said, there it is. Jesus said, how miserable is the body that depends on a body, and how miserable is the soul that depends on these two. That's what passes as a joke in 2nd century Coptic literature. but it's got a point. That is, it has a theology it's expressing. The ideal of a disembodied mind thinking the thoughts of God was an influence from contemporary Platonism. By way of contrast, Orthodox Christianity insisted on the resurrection of the body as an affirmation that human embodiment was a real and ultimate good. Christ in Orthodox theology took on a body to redeem the body. And just to be clear, I'm using Orthodox in the sense of correct belief, not in the sense of Eastern Orthodox distinguished from Roman Catholicism. Orthodox is at the small o this whole time, which just means the version that didn't become heresy. Tolkien's characterization of the human body, of the human condition, is famously enigmatic. And I'm not even going to talk about free will today. The Quenta Silmarillion begins its account of humanity's creation with a description of the strange gifts given by Eru to humanity. The first gift was, quote, that the hearts of men should seek beyond the world and should find no rest therein. So Tolkien describes a yearning for something more than the created world as fundamental to the human experience. The Quenta goes on then to speak of humans, quote, leaving the world, and calls them strangers and guests. Most notoriously, death is said to be a gift to humankind. Each of these details could be drawn straight out of Gnostic literature. At least two surviving Gnostic texts feature Alagenes, a Greek word meaning stranger or foreigner, as the protagonist who uncovers their own quasi-divine identity. In the Book of the Stranger, the protagonist describes their own death as, quote, what bound me has been killed and I've been released. That's someone describing their own death. I'll go up to my father, the one above all the great realms. Recall also the prince from the Hymn of the Pearl, sojourning in another country. This prince must throw off their clothes, the body, to return home. Gnostic Christians identified themselves as strangers to the world. The Gnostic, like the Platonist, practices alienating themselves from the world in life, but death is the ultimate release of the immaterial soul from its material trappings. Humans in the Silmarillion appear to be embodied from the beginning, but given an innate longing for something else. The label foreigner for the race of men calls into question whether they really are, by nature, part of the world. Death is celebrated, and there is no reference to the resurrection of the body. A reader could be excused for hearing echoes of ancient heresy, and as I'll argue in closing, Tolkien heard them too. So if you're jumping out of your seats to shout, talk about the Atherbeth, we're going to end there. I know. Oh, I missed a text. The term Gnostic, so saving knowledge. Criteria, 2 of 3 criteria are things we're looking at to ask whether or not Tolkien made himself a heretic on accident. The term Gnostic, Gnostikos, is derived from the noun gnosis, meaning knowledge or understanding. While there is no evidence that any Gnostic Christian ever identified themselves as a Gnostic, they all just call themselves Christians, knowledge does play a significant role in their story of salvation. It is knowledge that Jesus came to deliver to humanity, an understanding of ourselves as immaterial souls entrapped in a material world. Through this knowledge, humanity enters into the kingdom of God, set free from the concerns of this world and flesh. Knowledge plays no comparable role in The Lord of the Rings, or the Quenta. Rather, Tolkien's heroes are celebrated for their virtues, both Christian and cardinal. Heroes act for the good of others, cultivate nature, and oppose evil. Gandalf, a heavenly messenger, at least in the rewrite, does not counsel withdrawal from the affairs of the world, but on the contrary, kindles hope and inspires men to good deeds. Feanor and Saruman are, if anything, a caution against the pursuit of knowledge. But probably we should not expect saving knowledge in Tolkien's stories. There is, after all, no saving faith. Tolkien imagined his stories set in a thoroughly pre-Christian context. The revealed content of Christian theology is out of place in the first 3 ages of Middle-earth. And the whole point of Jesus in Gnostic thought is to reveal knowledge to a humanity that doesn't already have it. Whatever the character of Tolkien's theology, in his subcreation, probably the knowledge revealed by Christ ought to be absent from Tolkien's mythic prehistory of England. But what about the Valar? Even if the incarnate races remained ignorant themselves, shouldn't the powers that are literally in communion with the One reflect a Gnostic perspective on the world? Certainly Gandalf doesn't. But Gandalf's a late addition, at least to the Silmarillion. There is indeed a plausible case for a sort of Gnostic ethic in the rest of the Quintus Silmarillion. The Valar hardly encourage elves to remain involved in the affairs of Middle-earth. On the contrary, they draw the Calaquendi out of Middle-earth to live with them in irenic bliss, simply gazing on the light of the trees, which is exactly how Gnostic texts describe paradise. Like the man set free in Plato's allegory of the cave, then these elves return temporarily to Middle-earth to share the light that the light of Valinor with those who stayed behind. Withdrawal from the world, as encouraged by the Valar, certainly parallels the Gnostic perspective. Lastly, Tolkien states repeatedly that it is the Ainor's knowledge of the primordial music that gives them their power. And the ultimate destiny of the human race is to participate in the making of new music. If the music of the Ainur is the fundamental nature of reality, then we have something that resembles a Gnostic elevation of knowledge as humanity's highest aim. And indeed, the second music, the one the humans are going to do after the end in the eschaton, is explained in explicitly cognitive terms. Quote, then the themes of Iluvatar shall be played aright, for all shall then for all shall then understand fully his intent in their part, and each shall know the comprehension of each, and Iluvatar shall give to their thoughts the secret fire, being well pleased. Humanity, in Tolkien's eschatology, joins itself to the mind of God through a new understanding of fundamental reality. Here again, Tolkien's mythology resembles Gnosticism, at least it appears to. The most famous feature of Gnostic literature are its catalogs of primordial powers. In the Apocryphon of John, for instance, Jesus appears to his disciple John and explains to him the origin of the universe. He begins with the One and then describes the offspring of his thought. Barbalo, forethought, life, truth. These are the things that God is thinking about first. What does Barbalo mean? We don't know. Would love to tell you. There follows the innumerable lesser powers, each with their own domain. On the number, identity, ranks, and operation of these powers, there was significant disagreement among Gnostic groups, and even variation within the same school. These complex cosmogonies may have been the stuff of speculative theologians among the Gnostics. Probably they were inferences from theological postulates, not the dogma of conviction, which is to say, it's the kind of thing the nerds in your group would care about and nobody else cares about, right? They're sort of, even within one school, nobody agrees on the sort of exactly how many there are, or which, where they fall, or their names. Their role in Gnostic theology, however, seems fairly clear. These powers explain the existence of evil and the imperfect intervention of God to combat it. So two sides to the problem of evil there. The existence of it and God's imperfect intervention to fight it. Lesser powers in heaven are an answer to monotheism's perennial problem with the origin and the persistence of evil. If there is only one God who is both supremely powerful and entirely good, why should evil ever come to exist? And if God does, in fact, intervene in history, why has suffering and evil remained so prevalent? These are intractable problems, and I say that as a practicing Episcopalian. And yes, I read Boethius. Don't come at me with it. Don't need a confederacy of dunces going on. The existence of lesser powers in heaven creates some distance in the causal chain between the One and the origin of evil. The One, being perfect, can only create powers that are themselves entirely good. But any power that is not itself the One must be in some way inferior. Being made in the image of the One, moreover, these powers will themselves create lesser powers. They're going to imitate their creator. Think about the story of the origin of the dwarves. And no creature is equal to its creator. Somewhere along the way, then, creatures that are themselves good create something with the capacity for evil. And that capacity is eventually realized. Heavenly hierarchies create an explanatory gap, a bit of plausible deniability for the omnipotent and omnibenevolent creator. Likewise, any religion that prays to a supreme power involved in history is confronted by the relative inactivity of that power in the face of human suffering. it's all well and good to have a logical explanation for the origin of evil, but why doesn't an act of God do something about genocides now? The existence of multiple powers in heaven, each engaged in their own imperfect way with sustaining the world, can help explain an all-powerful God's failure to adequately address persistent evil. The powers, one can imagine, are opposing evil as best they can, but their efforts are not entirely effective. We begin by noting the striking similarity between Tolkien's Ainulindale and Gnostic cosmogony. In articulating this account of creation, Tolkien also seems preoccupied with the twin problems of evil outlined above. Melkor's music and revolt are credited with natural evils, withering heat, piercing cold, the disorder of the cosmos. So too divine intervention throughout the Quenta is performed almost exclusively by the less than omnipotent Ainur. Morgoth and his fallen Maiar enjoy considerable worldly success. Tolkien and the Gnostics reached similar solutions to similar problems. Now, there are differences worth noting. Melkor does not belong to some lower rung of the celestial hierarchy, and Eru does, in fact, intervene on at least one occasion. But the overarching similarities persist. Tolkien, like the Gnostics, populates heaven with myriad powers to mitigate monotheism's perennial problem with evil. So that's me steel manning the opposite position, right? You know, it's steel manning, like I'm trying to make the, and you can find expressions that aren't quite as detailed as that in some of the literature. How about another take? Let's try reading Tolkien charitably. The popular conception of Christianity as a simple monotheism principally concerned with belief in the popular conception of Christianity as just a monotheism that is principally concerned with with belief in a saving death of Jesus is a distinctively Protestant, post-Enlightenment picture of the Christian faith. And that's fine if that's what you're into. But Tolkien was a Roman Catholic, steeped in medieval literature. A comparison of Tolkien's mythology with some of the most prominent voices in Western theology throughout the Middle Ages seriously mitigates the force of all the parallels I just outlined. Heavenly hierarchies are heartily the reserve of heretics. A 5th century Greek author known as Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite wrote an enormously influential treatise titled On Celestial Hierarchies that enumerates the classes and orders of heavenly powers. Like the Gnostic Pleroma, that's the name of the whole system, and Tolkien's Ainur, they are emanations of the divine. Some dwell in blessed contemplation of the One, while others are allotted domains of cosmic, earthly, and elemental responsibility. Likewise, the 7th century Etymologies of Isidore of Seville was extremely popular in the Middle Ages. It was like the compendium of ancient knowledge in libraries, and of classical and early Christian scholarship. And its seventh book perpetuated a similarly bewildering array of supernatural powers, occupying heaven, micromanaging creation, and battling against evil. And these are only the fonts of medieval angelology. Similar hierarchies of primordial powers appear in the pre-Christian books of Enoch, are assumed by Ignatius of Antioch in his 2nd century epistle to the Trallians, and enjoyed a long life of elaboration in medieval sources after Dionysius and Isidore. But invoking primordial powers operating on behalf of God as a response to the problem of evil, Tolkien and the Gnostics are participating in a continuous tradition that predates Christianity itself. The comparison of Tolkien's hierarchies with the Gnostics is only impressive if we ignore medieval angelology. Likewise, it is possible to read the first gift of men to men as a disdain for it is possible to read that as a disdain for creation and a longing for disembodiment. It's a possible reading. Or it might be interpreted in light of the oft-repeated sentiment, memorably expressed in Augustine's Confessions, that our heart is restless until it rests in you. Ecclesiastes states that God placed eternity into the heart of every human, and medieval theologians took it as a given that humanity possessed an innate longing for the transcendent. The Christian position on the ultimate fate of the rest of creation has always been unclear. The Jewish prophecies of restored land and their New Testament echoes led many early Christians to affirm that God would ultimately restore the material world itself. But other Christians, like Augustine, rejected the restoration of the physical world. Tolkien, with his final emphasis on humanity's destiny to participate in a second music of the Ainur, apparently sides with Augustine and the majority position of the medieval church, that the present creation will be replaced with something new. It is likewise possible to read the promise of ultimate understanding and eternal contemplation of God as an elevation of knowledge as the highest good. That's the Gnostic reading, right? But the same hopes are well attested in Orthodox Christianity. Thanks to Augustine, whose own theology was thoroughly shaped by Neoplatonic thought, medieval Christians described the ultimate reward for redeemed humanity as, quote, the beatific vision. That is a spiritual, emphatically not physical. Augustine says you can close your eyes and you can keep looking. Emphatically not physical, gazing upon God that brings about full understanding. Here again, Tolkien and Gnosticism reflect, so both Tolkien and Gnosticism reflect broad currents of thought in Christianity, all under the common influence of Platonism. There remains Tolkien's problematic characterization of death as a gift, and his apparent ambivalence on human embodiment. For the latter, some blame might be laid at the feet of Western fathers like Jerome and Augustine for their pessimism about the flesh, critique of imagining physical rewards in heaven, and emphasis on the contemplation of God. So you can sort of see how some medieval Christians might have been inclined to feel that way based on reading those authors. But Christians throughout the Middle Ages viewed death as an enemy to be defeated and insisted on the resurrection of their physical bodies. I suspect rather that Tolkien's own context in Oxford in the 20th century played a larger role in his description of the human condition. Reductive materialism was fashionable in Oxford circles, and I think one can see in both Tolkien and Lewis an insistence on not identifying humanity with the physical body. But that's a whole other paper. I'm going to talk about that another time. Despite defending his account of humanity's gifts in his letters, Tolkien appears to have ultimately recognized the heterodox implications of his mythology. The Athrobeth of Finrod and Andreth, written in the late 1950s, characterizes the Silmarillion's account of humanity's creation as an elvish misunderstanding. Death, according to Andreth, is not human nature, as described in the Silmarillion. It is either the work of Morgoth or a punishment of Eru, depending on which voice in this dialogue you listen to, for some unspecified ancient sin. And humans will be restored to their immortal states, bodies explicitly included, when Arda is ultimately remade. There is no promise of second music in this revised eschatology. It is replaced, rather, with a promise of restoration. There are meaningful analogies in the end between Tolkien's mythology and Gnosticism. But in almost every case, both are participating in a wider, otherwise orthodox theological tradition. The exception is the characterization of death as a gift to be envied. The Athrobeth suggests that despite his repeated defense of his own mythology, he accepted, in the end, that the version of his cosmogony that he had written in the 1930s was not quite orthodox. So, he wrote this to reframe the story. People often quote Tolkien's claim that his stories were fundamentally religious and Catholic, but they omit the next line. He goes on to say that these stories were at first only unconsciously religious, but then made so in revision. But that revision toward theological orthodoxy continued for Tolkien after the publication of Lord of the Rings and in the writings omitted from the posthumously published Silmarillion. Thanks.
Lots of questions.
Oh, that's right. You did the mark. Hold on, back.
Hello, I really enjoyed that. I really appreciated that you defined when you were defining orthodoxy. I was curious if you could also define heresy, just to my understanding, because you use both of those a lot. So I want to make sure I'm understanding how those two relate in your.
Yeah, I wonder if I should have started there. I teach a course called Heresy, and the whole point of this is that those terms are sort of have a dialectical relationship. That in some ways they you can ask the member of any religious community and they can give you a sort of creed. They can lay out 15 things. That's orthodoxy for them, but it might be different for someone else. And it's, doing the work of history, I'm not going to tell you like a specific content for orthodoxy. The way the terms are useful is as describing the perspectives that in any given century become the viewpoint that Christians subsequently look back on as the correct perspective. It sounds like a huge convoluted thing, but it's I don't know. It's like asking to make a political analogy, or do I run away from political analogies? It's like asking like what pick your party name, what they believe. And it's like, well, that's changed over time. What Republicans believed in the 1930s is not the same thing they believe today. Obviously, nor is Democrats. So what does it mean to be that? It means to be part of a party that is sociologically defined. And specifically, we're going to be defining it in terms retrospectively in doing history. And one great example of this is there's a thinker named Bardaisan at the beginning of the 3rd century. And he is, in his own time, all the Orthodox writers writing about him, he is the champion of Orthodoxy against the Marcionite heresy. And then you move 50 years later, and he is the arch heretic of the Syrian Gnostics. Same dude, held perspectives. When he was fighting the Marcionites, they loved him. And then retrospectively, he holds certain beliefs that were uncontroversial at his time, that just like nobody really cared that he also believed those things, that people look back on and say, okay, that actually is now a heresy we're fighting now. So you can't give like you can't spell this out in terms of specific content. You have to sort of define these terms socially. So the perspectives that later win is kind of the answer, which is helpful for doing history and not much else.
Yes, as a Quaker, I can give an example of the fact that we have no creeds. Therefore, you would think we would have no heresies.
Mm-hmm.
There is most definitely a Quaker split with the Hicksites,
Yes.
and I can't even remember the other names.
Mhm.
So I think heresy is far more of a sociological phenomenon, as you're describing, than anything to do with religious doctrine or dogma or anything else.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just, well, we are going to do it different from you, and well, who's the real right one, and carry on from there.
For sure, which is not to say they don't actually disagree about stuff. These people disagreed about real content. They actually had
sure.
positions, opinions, and practices that differed between them. It's just that, Justin Martyr, who is the Orthodox champion of the 2nd century, does not hold Orthodox beliefs about the nature of Christ by the time you get to the 4th century.
Yeah, time moves on.
Yeah.
My question is, I've always believed that Tolkien's maintaining death was a gift from Iluvatar stemmed from the fact that his father died when he was 3 and his mother died when he was 12.
Oofta.
And he spent all of his subsequent life coming to terms with that.
Yeah.
And I just wondered how you might see that within the context that you've been talking today.
Yeah, I mean, that's a sort of separate question of like what motivates Tolkien to write this way. And that's kind of not what I was doing with the project, which is not to say it's not a wonderful question to ask. I don't know. I don't know. I can make some guesses, but I would want to write them on paper first.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I would love to hear your guesses, but if you don't want to,
we can talk about
it. And I was going to say, here's another way of not answering that question. Yeah. Of course, one of the important framing things, right, that seems to inform the whole death is a gift thing. Yeah. And in a sense, also almost call it into question as a doctrinal statement at all, right? Like, forget whether it's orthodox or heretical.
Yeah.
Right? Like, is it even doctrinal?
Right.
In any way? Is that what he brings out in the Athrobeth?
Yes.
This is the elf point of view, right? Of course, the elves are going to think that death is a gift, just like humans think that deathlessness is a gift, right? The elves don't think of deathlessness as a gift. It's how things are, right? And so to them, like that humans go somewhere else and that they, the elves, have enough trust in Iluvatar and the goodness of Iluvatar to believe that it's not just something hideous he's doing to them, like he's not just perpetrating some horror on the humans, and that but they don't get it. Right? In multiple senses of that phrase, they don't get it, right? They don't get death, right? And so of course, when they write about it, as it's them writing, right? Yeah. You know, in the Ainulindale, they're going to be like, yeah. Which would have been so much clearer had Christopher left the frame in.
Yeah, for sure.
Right, so that we have the elvish speaker of the Ainulindale instead of what sounds like an omniscient narrator.
And as a charitable reader of Tolkien, I would love to believe that's what Tolkien was doing all along. As someone who's read his letters,
Right.
There was no time where he was definitely trying to defend that as a doctrinal statement himself.
Yes. No, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. Though then again, we have to do like our reading of the letters also, right? And always applying Verlin Flieger's dictum, never read Tolkien's letters without thinking about whom he's writing to,
For sure.
because that's always impactful. Anyway, so I'm just saying it's another way of not answering the question, because of course his own personal interest and investment in death and what death means, certainly may well potentially have informed this. I mean, this is the guy who was like, well, obviously the primary theme of the Lord of the Rings is death, as is everything written by humans, right? Okay. All right. Tell us more, Professor. Well, but anyway, so, and I also like, again, it's not answering the question, but it is all interestingly related.
I think also tracing the arc of Nienna from Gothic Free Nienna to Our Lady of Sorrows will give us another interesting lens through which to interpret Tolkien's ideas about death through time. Anyway.
Yeah, early versus late.
Mark,
Nienna
behind you?
Really, Mark, here you go.
We also have a question on Zoom when you have a moment.
Actually, why don't we do that one first and then Mark?
Okay. Carl would like to know, is there any evidence that Tolkien was familiar with the contents of the Nag Hammadi library gospels that were discovered in 1945? And would they have influenced his later revisionism?
Great question. Almost certainly not. He would not have known Nag Hammadi. He would have, I would bet my lunch that he would know about Gnosticism through reading Orthodox sources. There were conversations about Gnosticism in his social circles. And particularly the Apocryphon of John, one of the three main sort of cosmological texts, is also extant in the Berlin Codex, which was discovered in the late 19th century. So and would have been published by Tolkien's time. And people knew about it. So if he wanted to go read Gnostics in their own language, he could have. I have no reason to think he did. That's kind of the overarching thrust of my paper. But he could have. His contemporaries did, and were sometimes sympathetic towards Gnosticism. They were discovered, obviously, in the 1940s, but they weren't really translated and published promptly. It took some time before they come into English, decades, in fact. The Gnostic Gospels published in 1970, which is a book. At that point, is still reading these texts primarily in Coptic. So no, I think almost certainly he does not know Nag Hammadi. He does, if he wants to, have access to the Berlin Codex, and he certainly knows early Christian heresiological accounts of Gnosticism, which is what Austin Farrer was reading. And Austin Farrer still thought, oh, there's really something here. I really like this stuff, at least for a while. And then he comes around and writes this essay.
And people will remember who did the Mythgard Academy stuff with me. Mrs. Farrer was the one who advised him not to do the round earth Ainulindale. Yes. She was the one whom we were all applauding and saying thank you, Mrs. Farrer, for stepping up there and telling him that was not as good as the other one. That's the person we're talking about here.
One of the few people who could have actually shaped the content of the Silmarillion.
Yes, yes. Right. Well, that was a different thing. The changing the Hobbit thing was different. But yeah, no, this was a real impact on the development of the Ainulindale text itself. So yeah.
So my question came up while you were in the second part.
Cool.
Saying, no, Tolkien wasn't a heretic because Orthodoxy covers all these things. So why is Gnosticism a heresy?
Awesome question. Yeah, no, phenomenal, because that is sort of the thrust of the second half, is Augustine, Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, reintroduce all sorts of Neoplatonic elements into Orthodox Christianity. That's a little bit of a simplification. It's not like people before them didn't have them, but come on, we're doing simplifications here. And the one thing that I said sort of makes Gnosticism describable as a movement is it's influenced by Platonic thought. So what makes Gnostic heretics? And the answer to that still is there are certain things that they denied, like the resurrection of the body, the good of creation, God's role as creator, which some Gnostics believed in, but most didn't. There are certain core convictions that, like the resurrection of the body, are grounded in the narrative of the life of Jesus Christ. 1 Corinthians 15, Jesus was raised in the flesh, becomes the warrant for belief in the resurrection of the body, although Paul himself was very complicated about that. But they denied certain things that Augustine, even at his most Neoplatonic, even when he most despises the body and adopts the most sort of drastic light Manichaean position against Pelagius, he still never goes as far as the Gospel of Thomas, the Apocryphon of John. He still maintains a sort of base level of basic orthodoxy on some of these beliefs that are grounded in the story Christians told about the life of Jesus.
So it's not about they're going in the wrong direction. It's just they're going further than the Orthodox.
Yeah.
The Orthodox is drawing the line much.
That's right.
Much further.
They remain committed to Jesus took on a body to save the body, and the Gnostics are not.
Right.
For example, there are other examples of things, but that's one of them.
Yeah.
That's complicated. There's lots of Orthodox defined feminines. The whole Syriac tradition has the Holy Spirit as a feminine, using feminine pronouns. There's divine wisdom traditions. There's lots of divine feminine positions that are Orthodox. They are not what Gnostics took on. And unfortunately, Gnostics are not the nice proto-feminists that Elaine Pagels characterized them as. They're actually also extremely patriarchal in lots of ways. They just happen to believe that women get to leave their corrupt body, which is, by the way, worse than men's bodies according to their theology, and accept. So they're not the sort of champions for. There's a hand in the back if you want feminism either. But sorry, I will slow down. I apologize.
From my point of view, that was great. The one thing we just touched on there was, are you kind of saying, well, they believe this but went too far? Again, this is kind of from what a Catholic would consider Orthodox. There's a distinction between heresy and schism, which would be, which doesn't undermine, but sort of modifies the definition of societal in terms of, you may have two groups that believe the same thing but split anyway. So may or may not be societal. There's an aspect, but it may not be as definitive. The second piece is within Catholicism, there's something called a persistent heretic, which is somebody who, having been told, no, you're wrong, rather than say, oh, I see what you're saying now, says, no, I'm right and you're wrong. And that, is, in addition to being the human condition, is a thing. The final piece was, again, from an Orthodox point of view, if you're saying I'm Orthodox, and just about everybody does, you say you're going this way or you're going that way, in this direction or that direction. It's sort of the same thing. Nothing is evil in the beginning. So what you take is an extreme and make it the center, or somehow or other go too far in an extreme. So Augustine took Plato and successfully integrated it into Christianity. And the problem before then, of course, was how do we make Plato and Christianity work? In the same way that Aquinas did the same thing for Aristotle. So you had all sorts of folks who would be considered heretics earlier who were trying to use Aristotelian ideas, and it had to be so.
And the Cappadocians did it better than Augustine, by the way. So just on the schism point for everyone, schism is when you have a sort of division of communities without doctrinal differences. So from a certain perspective, from the Roman perspective, the Eastern Orthodox are in schism because they refuse to acknowledge the authority of the Pope, despite the fact that they hold Orthodox theological positions. So, yeah. Was there a question there that I missed? Okay. Cool.
We should probably move forward, but I have one final thought, which is that I was thinking, you made me think about this when you were talking about the idea of the second music.
Yes.
And how he seems to kind of leave that idea behind later on.
Yes.
And my suspicion is that what he describes in the Athrobeth that is the second music, basically. That way, or rather, the second music becomes a more simple one paragraph metaphor, or it would work the other way around.
Yeah.
He would see that as an expansion of and like an explication of what the second music would be like, in that Art of Remade, the whole theology of Art of Remade.
I think that's what he thinks in the 1950s.
Yes.
I still read the 1930s and some of the things that are rejected
totally
as not quite there.
No. I completely agree. I completely agree. Yeah. No, that is a 1950s thing. But what I was saying is, I think in the 50s, that's how he's kind of like recasting. That it's. I suspect that in the 50s, he is seeing the Athrobeth as like a gloss on that idea, rather than replacing it. That he's explicating.
I think that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.